record earlier on. You're all very welcome. It's a great joy to have you here at the second of 4 Corrymeela Advent events for Advent 2021. My name is Pádraig Ó Tuama, and I am delighted to be with you for these 4 events where we'll be talking together with people who've been writing about spirituality and the Gospels and conflict in order for us to have some conversations together about how those things can be part of our own lives and how we can find a way to live in with more ease, really, with conflict, thinking about what might fruitful conflict look like, as well as thinking about how it is that the gospel texts can be supportive for us. Normally, I live in Ireland, but I'm on a short-term writing residency in New York City in the USA at the moment, and New York is Lenape land, and in fact, the name Manhattan is a Lenape word, and I'm living in Manhattan at the moment. Manhattan, I think the original word was Manhattan, and I think it means place of many hills. There used to be a lot of hills on Manhattan, but some of them were flattened. There is one part of the northwest corner of the island where it remains as it would have been found. I'm looking forward to going up there to honouring the Lenape people and hopefully advocating for justice and recognition for them. This is a Corrymeela event together with friends from across the water in Britain, and Corrymeela is a peace and reconciliation community working with about 10,000 people a year in programs of dialogue and retreat and learning and reflection and argument. Some of those are on online forums like this, weekly emails, events in their own communities, as well as events at our centre on the north coast of Ireland. So Corrymeela does a lot of work with a lot of different groups of people, imagining what it might mean to look at how we can live in the response time and in the aftermath of conflict in terms of British-Irish conflict, thinking about what peaceful relations can look like on the island of Ireland. And Corrymeela is one member of a writing group where we offer reflections on the Sunday Gospels through the lens of conflict. And this is what's going to be informing our Advent series this year. Last week, for those of you who were here, you met Alex Wimberley, who's the leader of the Corrymeela community, and you'll see links to that on our social media if you missed it and want to see it. And this week, I am delighted that we have Ruth Harvey, who's the leader of the Iona Community. I'll introduce her in just half a minute. But next week, we have Janet Foggy, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Community Energy Scotland. And the week after that, our final Advent one for 2021, we have Pat Bennett, who is a writer and a scientist and a liturgist. So I have a whole bunch of questions for Ruth, and then we'll have time for a Q&A as well. So first of all, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Ruth Harvey. So here is Ruth Harvey. Ruth, it is so good to have you here. I'm going to embarrass you in a while by giving you a warm introduction, but do you want to say a quick hello first?
Good to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm sitting in Penrith in the northwest of England in the old county of Cumberland.
So Ruth Harvey is the leader of the Iona Community. The Iona Community, I think I looked it up, is it 83 years old this year?
Yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar with it, I want to read the Iona Community's, the opening of its statement about itself, because it will give you a great insight as to who Ruth is in her role as the leader of this community and what she's called to do. So the Iona Community is a dispersed Christian ecumenical community working for peace and social justice, rebuilding of community, and the renewal of worship. The Iona Community is a community of people from different walks of life and different traditions in the church, engaged together and with people of goodwill across the world, enacting, reflecting, and praying for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. The Iona Community are convinced that the inclusive community they seek must be embodied in the community they practice. So you see here already that within the context of this, the relationship between gathering together in community and practicing the values that are at the heart of it are so important. So Ruth is a long-term member of the Iona Community. We might hear about that in a while, and has been the leader since 2020. In fact, I sat on the sofa next to her while she was writing her application, which is, I kind of feel like maybe I had a little bit of influence, hopefully for good and not bad. And previous to Ruth getting the job as the leader of the Iona Community, she was the director of Place for Hope, which is an organization that specializes in facilitating conflict, mediation, and dialogue with communities of worship, especially in Scotland, but not only in Scotland. Ruth is an ordained minister in the Holy Church of Scotland and is also a member of the Society of Friends, the Quakers. So, Ruth, I am delighted to welcome you here to this conversation for Advent about Gospels and spirituality and conflict.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, I want to start off in the way that I'm starting off with everyone, Ruth, which is to ask you a slightly personal question, which is, what are some of the habits you notice about yourself when you're in conflict?
Well, that's a really good question to start with. I mean, one of the things that I've learned is that I'm learning more the habit of how to avoid, or how to turn up my avoidance kind of volume, I suppose. And I say that advisedly. I'm somebody that tends to walk towards conflict. I kind of almost naively sometimes can walk into situations and go, oh, well, let's just see how we got on here. And I have learned the art in the last few years, particularly, of what it means to step back. And so I use the word avoid in that sense, a really positive sense of being able to notice when it's time just to turn down the volume a bit, or to withhold my voice a little bit, or to step to the side and allow events to unfold. So that's a habit I've learned, and that kind of reveals a habit that I think I intrinsically had from a very early age, which was just to kind of walk towards and not be afraid of conflict in a slightly rash way, I think, and learning the nuance of knowing that that's not always necessarily the right thing to do.
Yeah. You know, over the years of working in conflict myself, I've often heard some people kind of go, oh God, I'm just a conflict avoider, as if that's always a bad thing. And sometimes I think, I mean, of course, if that's the only thing you do with conflict, it's probably not going to be fruitful. But having the skill of knowing when to avoid something can be really helpful at times.
Well, yeah, I mean, the word avoid, it's maybe a tricky word, because it does assume, it can assume running away from and you know, burying your head in the sand. And I wouldn't advocate that necessarily, but I think it's important to know how to stay safe, actually, and also when to stop talking and when to stop intervening. So it's a slightly counterintuitive one, but that's been one of my big learning curves, Pádraig. Yeah.
Honestly, I used to lead Corrymeela, and I would say that during my time of leading Corrymeela, that too was a lesson that I learned. I wonder if the roles of these roles bring that along.
Yeah.
So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at a text that you've chosen, something that you've written about. You've got a prayer about it too. And then we're also going to have conversations about conflict that emerges in congregations, because you have many years of working alongside denominations and bishops or area deans and congregants and congregational leaders in Scotland and England and further afield as well, in supporting them to pay attention to conflict. So we'll talk both about the text as well as your experience within that. So first of all, I wonder if we could share the text. Thanks very much to Johnny Clark, who's supporting us with all of this admin as we're in here. And Ruth, if you would be happy to read that text.
So these words from the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 20 to 26. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one, as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Father, I desire that those also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory, which you have given me because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Righteous Father, the world does not know you, but I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them.
Thanks, Ruth. I had this strange fantasy as you were reading that this was a kind of an exact transcript about what Jesus of Nazareth said in the Last Supper. Obviously, it was written many decades later, but I was imagining the poor person having to do the shorthand, going, what? The one in what? The who? The love? So it can be quite a confusing text to look at all of these formulations. In a certain sense, Jesus of Nazareth is saying the one thing over and over again in different formulations. So I wonder, could you talk to us about why this is an important text for you?
Well, I think that was one of the things that really struck me as I was reading this text through the lens of conflict transformation, that I think I counted Jesus says the same thing 7 times in 7 different ways, i.e., I am one with you, Holy One, and we're all one, and we're in each other, and they're in me, and I'm in them. And I think there's a management kind of rubric which says to get good communication across, you need to say the same thing 7 different times, usually in 7 different ways, before people will actually get it. And that's something I've learned in mediation work, and also in all charity work, and just as good human communication, that don't assume that if you send one email, everyone will understand what it is you mean. You might have to make a phone call or send another kind of social media message, or send the same email in a different way. So looking at that, and I think I'd also always read this text as somebody who's been committed to the ecumenical movement and to the whole world of interfaith dialogue as well, an extension of ecumenism, if you like. I've looked at this text as the key text, as, you know, Jesus calling us to be one as he and the Father are one. Reading this text through the lens of conflict, I'm drawn to the whole notion of empathy, that and it's not just standing alongside somebody. It's actually a deep empathy when you're almost folded into each other, and the fear that can come through that experience. I've experienced fear when I've empathized that much, and I can say a bit more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that you're talking about, earlier on, we're talking about conflict, and you're talking about the reality of conflict in all your professional life. Like, is oneness possible in the midst of conflict?
Well, it depends what your goal is. I mean, if your goal is, and I don't even know if this is a desirable goal, kind of organic unity. And I'm thinking about, I love your sirens, and is that
I know, sorry.
No, it's great. It's a reality check. Don't do that. Turn it on again. Yeah. And in the context of the ecumenical movement, I remember there was always this conversation: are we really looking for organic unity when we all simply become one organization? And, you know, my response would be, no, that's not the unity that we're called to. It's a unity that allows us to be holy ourselves at the same time as being holy in the context of the other. And that's an emptying and a divesting ourselves of all the power and all the assumptions that we make for a while about ourselves in order fully to embrace the other. And that's the kind of oneness that I think we're being pointed to here. And I certainly, when I read this text through the lens of conflict transformation experience, that's where I get to.
Yeah, you know, for many years I worked in the ecumenical movement too, and earlier on, you know, I was in circles where people were going, we completely believe in church unity, everyone should become a Catholic. Like, that's what we're looking for. Church unity will happen when everyone comes home to Rome. And within the context of that, it's unity and we'll be in charge. And I'm sure other denominations have the same thing too. I'll speak about Catholicism because, you know, that's the DNA in me. How do you pay attention to how, in the name of unity, sometimes something a little bit poisonous can come in terms of dominance? We'll be in charge.
Yeah, I mean, there's an assumed superiority that some denominations automatically have, and I remember being struck very and by the humility of some of the bigger denominations. So I live now in England, where, you know, I'm part of the Anglican diocese, and I live in Cumbria, which is, I'm a Presbyterian and a Quaker, but I'm within this Anglican diocese. And as soon as I cross the border, I'm in the Presbytery of Annandale and Eskdale in Scotland. And those two big denominations, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, I've heard them both speak very humbly about what it means to be the kind of national church. And I'm using that word advisedly, and the assumed superiority that let us make all the decisions, and then we'll invite others in, and then it'll be ecumenical. And I know that there's a great deal of self-awareness about how that is absolutely not ecumenical, and not the spirit of the oneness that we're talking about, at least not always. There are times when we recognize the distinctiveness of each of us and can lean on each other and on our specialisms, and that works in human life and it works in denominations. But I think there can be a toxic assumption that biggest is best, and we know
yeah. I know that, just coming back to the text in particular, that empathy is a really powerful thing that you bring from that text, and that you look at that text as a practice of empathy rather than a practice of organizational oneness. Say a little bit more about like how heavily you weigh empathy. And I think just to give folks a weighing of this, like you have worked for decades working with congregations where it could seem at times that the congregation is going to schism, or that people hate each other, or that people are profoundly hurt. And so when you say empathy, you're saying this having known the exact opposite of it. So could you say a little bit more about empathy?
And I have to correct you, I haven't quite worked for decades yet. I'm a
centuries.
Eons. No, I've been involved with Place for Hope since it started about 10 years ago, but I've been a mediator for a little bit shorter than that. Anyway, I'd learned about empathy in various listening courses that I'd done, and certainly in my training in Place for Hope. It's about that deep accompaniment where you can't pretend that you've got the experience of the other, but you're listening to such an extent that you're willing to be changed and transformed by what the other is saying. And I have experienced bits of that, and I understand it. However, I had one particular experience which I will never forget, when this text really did speak to me, and the notion of being folded in to the experience of somebody whose life was completely different from mine was overwhelming and powerful and very informative, in that I experienced what it was like to suspend my own set of beliefs for a short time and my own assumptions about what was right and wrong, in order to allow this voice of this individual to come in. Now, I was in the role as a mediator, but I was asking the others in the room to do the same thing. We did a lot of laying of the ground, or the ways of working together, which is what we call the ground rules. We were going to be listening in order to be changed. We were going to listen in order to understand the other, rather than necessarily to agree. We were going to not interrupt, and we'd laid down all the ways of working. So I was expecting everyone else to do the same, and I was doing the same also. So this individual who spoke very powerfully from a context which not only is different from mine, but one that I really struggle with. He as a man, he was presenting views which I found offensive, deeply offensive. In order to stay in the room, however, and to keep him and the others who were with him in the room, I did have to suspend my judgments. And what I experienced was utterly exhausting and utterly draining and deeply disturbing at one level. And one of the results was he stayed in the room, and he told us he felt listened to. So I think there's a huge cost when it comes to empathy of that kind, and a deep listening. And I guess in the Iona community, we talk about radical hospitality, and that trips off the tongue. This is radical empathy, in that it's empathy to such an extent that you're willing to be changed by it.
Wow.
But not to lose yourself in there, and also be able to call out bad behavior, to not allow offensive behavior to persist. But there's a journey to go on, and it was deeply costly to me personally. Yeah.
And do you think that for you there are times and seasons when you'll do that, but other times when you go, actually someone else can do that now, I don't want to be the one in the room where I'm hearing offensive stuff? Or do you think how do you hold wisdom within the context of that, as to when it's wise and when it's not?
Well, first of all, in Place for Hope, which was the context in which I was doing this work, we always work in pairs, partly for that reason, because it's important to protect one another and to be able to notice the cost that each other is actually paying, the price each other is paying, and to look at the participants, because if we're bearing that burden in a conflict, they're going to surely be bearing that, if not much more of a burden, if they're doing what we're asking them to do, which is really listen deeply to the other.
Yeah,
it's going to be a cost. So you need to have people there, not on your own, and I certainly lent heavily on supervision and coaching afterwards to debrief and to take really good care of myself. And I would completely urge anyone involved in this work to do a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
And certainly for me, you know, I recognize that there's a limit to how much of that you can do in any one period that I could do. I needed to find my own limit and acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you begin to see the whole world through the lens of conflict, and that's not necessarily healthy.
No. Could you say a little bit about some of the circumstances? And these will obviously be anonymized and kind of spoken in general rather than the church down the road. Could you say a little bit about some of the circumstances that you encountered in the role of mediator who's accompanying a congregation or denomination who are facing something? What are some of the things that you saw, the circumstances that brought them to you and your work through Place for Hope and others? And then also with that, like, what did you notice?
Well, I mean, the whole range of stuff from kind of sublime to the ridiculous, but each would be for the individual congregation or people involved. This was the really major presenting issue, no matter how trivial it might have seemed to us or to anyone looking in from the outside. So, for example, a congregation having to decide between 3 buildings which one they were going to close, and that was it ended up being a whole community dialogue, a large facilitated dialogue in the village, in the town hall, actually. We used a Samoan circle technique to make sure everyone's voice was heard, and they eventually came to a decision about which of those churches, those beloved churches, they were going to have to close.
Yeah.
Through to a very public and protracted vilification of one church leader, and working with them to support them through a time of really deep hurt and betrayal and potential litigation, at which point obviously mediation has to step away, and to know your limits as a mediator, that you don't, to know when to step back. Through to a big strategic conversation across a very large geographical area and involving ultimately hundreds of people in order to work out what the future of this area was going to look like in a particular denomination. And then, the last one would be just a very, very closed group, just 5 people in the congregation were the only ones who knew this was happening, and we were having a conversation about the nature of ministry, because there was a major falling out between some of the leaders of the lay leaders of the congregation, the ordained leaders of the congregation, but and then the minister. So they were having a major, in the end, theological battle about what the definitions of ministry were and who did what bits of it.
Yeah.
In all of sorry.
Well, I was going to say they're all huge in terms of that. And one of the things that I know that you're so skilled at is saying to people, you have urgency and urgency about your urgency in terms of what decision are we going to make. And you so helpfully create generous time to say, we will help you do that, but there's other things to be acknowledged alongside of this. And some of the things that people can justify when urgency is high can mean that actually listening goes out the window, or empathy, or you begin to employ tactics where you demean anybody that you disagree with, for instance. So like, I know that intervening is about creating more space than people think there is. Could you say a bit about that Samoan circle you used? Because I'm curious about how that goes about, and are people resistant to that and all that?
Well, they were so it was new to them all in this particular context that they were really open, and they knew they needed some kind of help. And so we simply, we said, this is what we think will work. Will you go for it? And they said, yes. I should say a thing about the time, Pádraig, that you mentioned earlier, that typically people say, can you come and help us? And can you help us sort this out really quickly? Because we've got urgent work to do for the mission of the church. So we need to get this out of the way. And I always say, laterally, when I was working for Place for Hope, I would say 2 things. One is, how long did it take you to get into this situation? And there's, maybe months, maybe decades, actually. And then the answer is, well, it might take you that long to get out of it. So don't, we can't rush this. And secondly, doing this process well is the best kind of mission you could ever do, because if the people of the community can see a local faith community taking conflict seriously, there could be a curiosity that, well, that looks like a very human, very well thought through organization, we'll give it a go. So that was my response to the whole time thing. And we were once or twice caught out in a situation where a church leader would say, this is taking too long, I'm now intervening because we've just got to make decisions. And I think that was in those situations which I was involved in, that was the death knell to that process. That there was not enough time given to the building of the trust and of the sustainable relationships. The Samoan Circle is a series of, well, we actually did a version of it, so it's probably not strictly if you were to Google Samoan Circle and do it to the letter, but basically you have at the core, it could be up to 8, but maybe 4 or 5 or 6 people who will speak and be the only ones speaking, and they'll be surrounded by, in this context it was about 6 concentric circles of other people who could all hear what was happening in the middle, with the microphone obviously in the middle. And then at certain points, the key thing is to agree what quite a noisy siren.
I know, it's nothing urgent. It's just somebody practicing. I seem to live on a street where people do that all the time.
The key thing in a Samoan Circle, like in lots of these situations, is to find a really heartfelt question to put at the center of it. So it has to be an emotive question that's going to really touch the hearts of the people who are there, not just the minds, but the hearts. And once you've found that question and you've given it to that inner circle and they've rehearsed their responses and maybe had a little bit of a difference of opinion, then there might either be an empty chair or one person will vacate, and you'll swap in others who will be invited in to join their voice. And the really other important thing, apart from finding a really good question, the really important thing about any of these large listening circles is that the people who are effectively on the outside circles have a very active part. They're needing to be briefed that their role is to stay silent and not to make any kind of non-verbal comments, if you like, laughter, for example, or dismissive voices, and also to concentrate really, really well and listen really, really carefully. So they are active participants in it. And this one ran its course until we were able to say, does anybody else want to come and say anything about this issue at all? And once nobody did, and we summed up what we thought the mind of the group was, and we gave everyone a chance to again respond and say, is there anything that needs to be said? And then when nobody else came forward, at that point we were able to say, well, in that case, when you leave here, let there be, try and be disciplined and not have car park conversation when you rehash the decision outside the meeting, which is one of the dynamics that can sometimes happen. But hold heard here.
Wow. I mean, there's so much precision in that. Like often when I was mediating conflict, one of the conflicts that was in the room is that people didn't agree on the thing they were disagreeing about. There's 5 or 6 or 26 or 40 different arguments happening in the room. And by honing it down to say, we're here talking about this particular question, that in itself is an extraordinary intervention with the congregation. Because some people might be saying, we're talking about which building to close, and other people are going to be saying, well, actually, we're talking about how we don't like the minister, and somebody else is going to be saying, we don't like the denomination, and we haven't since that decision was made 20 years ago. And so all of those things are happening at the same time. So finding that one question is so complicated. It's another level to oneness here, one question.
Yeah, and being upfront and saying that kind of thing in front of the group and saying, look, we're going to have to decide on one question, but we know that there are another 20 that this will spawn. And you can use things like a parking chart to make sure that, anybody's unresolved questions are captured. And but that, it's always a partial process. There will always be people who feel that their voice hasn't been heard fully. But as long as you give as many opportunities as possible for folks to voice their concerns, you do the best you can. It's not a perfect process.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of come back to the text that we were looking at and to see if you could read that prayer. I wonder, Johnny, if you'd be able to share the prayer so that Ruth, and then just to hear a little bit more about how, as a practitioner, you think about the dynamics in a room and then enacting a prayer that could be beneficial. So I think.
So let's pray. Holy and one, We pray for a world where we are so folded into the other, not that all views are meshed, but that the depth of sharing and the reach of love may draw us to a deeper justice, a fuller peace, for the sake of the world. Amen.
Why, in the context of thinking about your work and these years of practitioner work, so interested in how even in this quantification, not that all views are meshed, like the prayer itself is making space for the continuance of disagreement in a space of oneness.
Pádraig, I missed your question. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I think my internet froze. I'm just so curious, Ruth, about the way within which in the middle of that prayer, there's that line that says, not that we're so folded into each other that all views are meshed. There's a way within which the prayer itself is giving a little bit of conflict education. I just find that a very helpful way that you've done it. I'm curious about why you brought that in.
Well, I guess that the experience that I've relayed to you about being folded into the other and it being a very uncomfortable thing, I wanted to relay that in prayer and to acknowledge that, you know, the oneness to which we're called through the scripture, through the reading, can be uncomfortable, can feel, for me, it felt deeply distressing. I left that mediation in tears, and I was, I felt, you know, I felt very disabled. And if I felt like that, think of, obviously the world is full of violent, aggressive, terrifying conflicts. So I've just had a little tiny experience of that. So I guess I was just trying to convey in the prayer the enormity of that folded in, and then also to acknowledge that, you know, that the I guess the image I have of the Trinity is of the Celtic knot, where there's as much space as there are lines in that knotwork, to signify that three are one is three, and yet there's also lots of space in there to be fully ourselves. So you know, and my worry, my fear, my terror after that empathy experience was that I would become the worst of that person that I had witnessed, and I needed to find a way to step back and stay safe, I suppose.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. There's all kinds of concerns that come up in that. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to bring up one other area that you have been really vocal about, and then we're going to move into some Q&A. So just to let people know, we will have Q&A in a while. There's a few ways you can do it. You can type your question into the chat there, and I'll try to come to as many as I'm able. You're also able to click the raise your hand button, and if you've done that, we'll come to you, or we'll come to as many as we're able. And just so you know that if you've clicked that, we'll ask you to, we'll unmute you, and you're giving permission for yourself to be recorded. So just make the decision if you have a question about which one of those. And I will have a little ad about that Spirituality of Conflict book as well coming up. But Ruth, you are from Scotland. You live in the north of England, and not just in the last couple of years, but for many years, voting patterns in Scotland and England differ. Obviously, questions to do with national identity, the ways within which that border between Scotland and England, whether it should be there, where it should be, how it should be marked, all of those things are long-term public questions, political as well as personal, in the lives of England and Scotland. Could you share a little bit about how it is that you hold those together and speak about those, and wish for people to speak about that England-Scotland border?
Well, I live in Cumbria. Thank you. What an invitation. I've got a big map of the United Kingdom. You can't see it's in front of me. I've got Europe behind me. I need to get the world somewhere else. I think borders always have fascinated me. We moved around a lot when I was a child. And then I met and married an English man, and I've lived in Cumbria, and my children have grown up, and I want them to be proud to be English, because I want them to be proud to be where they come from, where they're from. And it's only since I've moved here, over 20 years ago now, that I've realized how fraught and how tense that border is in my soul. Now I know it. I knew it as a child on the terraces of football and rugby pitches, but I now know it in a different kind of way. And I think I've got a little insight, a tiny little insight into the border crossing that so many people are forced to do in this world. And I think about, the channel between France and England, and the people who are chucked onto that border and then chucked off it and lose their lives because of the abysmal, appalling laws of our land. So I don't claim to have the last word, of course, on boundary dwelling. And there are many people in the world who are forced across borders in ways that I never will have to be, and forced to identify themselves in ways that I will never have to be, both emotionally and also physically. So the border that I cross between Scotland and England just gives me a little insight into that experience. And what I've learned is that it's all about identity and belonging at a really deep level. And it does parallel for me with the conversation we had earlier, Pádraig, about the world church and the ecumenical dialogue, and what's the oneness that we're seeking. It's not an organic unity, it's a unity where we can live at peace with the other in a very deep way. And there are two things that my work in conflict has taught me about living on a border. One is the quality of the conversations that we have, particularly around things like an independence referendum in Scotland. That interests me much more, the quality of the conversation, the depth of the listening that we're going to do, than the outcome. And then the second thing for me is that the real art and skill, one of the many arts and skills in conflict transformation work, is the ability to develop a really deep curiosity about the other. So to be curious and literally to say, I'm really curious, I haven't heard that view before, tell me more. And then to listen to the more, and to let the more really impact you. And that includes a lot of silence, because you can't really be listening to the other if you're rehearsing what you're going to say next. And so I've learned as a Quaker too, and I've learned the hard way because I'm not a natural at the silence stuff. I've learned how to be quiet and to listen. I'm still learning that art. So I guess there's a lot about curiosity and about noticing the otherness that has gift for us. And it's about an identity that's deeper than just the geography where I land. I mean, something about thrownness, there's something about, again, I was thrown into this world. I landed as a Presbyterian in Scotland. I didn't have much choice about that. And I love my roots and where I'm from and knowing where I'm from. And I feel privileged that I know where I'm from, and I'm, I'm allowed to dwell in that and relish that. And I know that not everybody, the struggles over land and identity across the globe are huge. And I don't take my thrownness for granted. But that doesn't mean I've got any right to be xenophobic or and I should just watch my pride, I suppose. I think pride, is a great thing to some extent, but like all of the 7 deadly sins, it's the overabundance of good things that leads to the destruction of the other sometimes. And I just need to watch that.
Yeah, it's very helpful. We're going to come to some questions in a while, but first of all, I want to show you just the cover of the book that's just come out, and what were you arguing about along the way, which is meditations on for Advent, for Lent, for Christmas, for Easter, where we are offering reflections on the gospel text through the lens of conflict. There's the book. It's just available this week from Canterbury Press, and you can order it through your local bookshop, or you can get it online as well. Canterbury Press have a great bookshop, so you can buy it directly from their website or wherever you like to get books. So Pat Bennett was the editor for this. It's a collection of writers from across Britain and Ireland who wrote it, and Pat will be the guest on the 4th of these Advent events. So let's come to some questions. Ruth, one question that had come in the chat was, you'd mentioned earlier on that not everybody will be totally happy with, when you're having a congregation discuss something big, which of our 3 churches should shut down while we amalgamate, etc. Not everybody will be happy. People will be disappointed, even though they might say that was an inclusive process of decision making. How do you cope with powerful disappointment in a room?
It's a great question. I remember one of our supervisors, Charlie Irvin, saying to us as mediators that the work of a mediator continues after the resolution, if you like, because there will always be people who will be disappointed or will not, the result won't be what they were expecting. And so it would be important in faith-based mediation work to hang around, to be around for the, to allow people the space to express, that wasn't exactly what I was expecting, or how do I now live with the consequences? So, and also, giving people a bit of forewarning that, we will come to the end of this process, but it might not be what we were all expecting.
Yeah. That can be a complicated thing. And I mean, somebody else was asking, like, the Samoan circle is one model for how a group can hear each other. It's conflict resolution has probably about, 3 million models. How do you go about learning about more models for how groups can not just listen to the loudest?
Well, I mean, there's organizations, like one of the partners within this project is called Place for Hope. And well, as you know, and I was working with them before, and Place for Hope does a one-day program on growing through change and conflict, which in the afternoon gives you a series of skills. Like, you learn a bit about the Samoan circle, and you learn a bit about the listening chair and about the fishbowl. And I think any good facilitation skills training as well, the Ken Harvey Institute in Glasgow does great facilitation skills training. There's a wee plug for them, but there's doesn't need to be conflict training. I think we sometimes in Place for Hope talked about enhanced common sense, that a lot of the work we did, that's not to belittle common sense. It actually, we need training sometimes in common sense, if that's not an oxymoron, but there's an assumption, I think, sometimes, and especially in faith circles, church circles, that we're all good listeners here. We're all listening very carefully, but I didn't know that the process of setting aside my own thought processes, I didn't realize how much energy and time and practice it would take to do that really well. So I think any skills you can get around listening are just second to none. And most mediations that I was involved in, communication skills was at the heart of it.
Okay, very helpful. Somebody else has a question. Let me see. Oh, it just moved there. Caroline Wortman had a question. How do you manage people's fear as they struggle to enter the vulnerability of encountering themselves and one another? I mean, that's clearly, it's not just relationships between me and another person. It's my relationship with my own fear as well. How do you support that?
A massive question. Thank you for that. And I think, one of the things that I really valued in the Place for Hope training was that the first module of the mediation, of the practitioner training, was all about personal growth and us working on ourselves, partly on understanding our own conflict style and how we respond to conflict, so that we can be alert to that, but also doing lots of prayerful reflection, becoming reflective practitioners, so that we understood what the triggers in our own stories were that would make us fearful in a situation. And by default, therefore, in a mediation context, that training was meant to alert us to the fact that others may also typically be coming with some level of fear or anger or some kind of high level of emotion. And again, not even simply acknowledging that and saying into the room, look, folks, it would be very surprising if there wasn't some anxiety in the room, or even fear. You can couch it in that kind of language. And thank you for saying that. It's just good that it's been acknowledged.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
I mean, you can also, if you're working in pairs, it's possible if somebody's very distressed, obviously you need to pause the process and allow a distressed individual, whether that's through fear or upsetness, to step out of the process for a while, to pause. And not be afraid of emotion.
Yeah. Is there a high level of fear or a high level of fear of failure involved? Like, do people feel like, God, our congregation has been in conflict and therefore the minister feels like a failure, or the parish council does, or the individuals, and they're embarrassed to ask for help?
Totally. One of the biggest dynamics that I noticed in my work when I was working for Place for Hope was that typically in a faith context, the stage at which people would ask for help was if there's five levels of conflict, from the problem to solve at the bottom. This is the Speed Lee's levels of conflict, through a disagreement, through a contest, through fight or flight, to intractable problem. In faith context, they would ask for help after the contest level 3 had gone on sometimes for decades. Whereas I mean, this is a huge generalization, but typically in more in less faith-based work contexts, you might be asking for help at level 2. Now, like I've said, that's a massive generalization and it didn't always hold. But what I noticed was that there was a real embarrassment that we should be able to deal with this ourselves, that good Christians don't fall out. Where did that come from? Which gospel are you reading when you read that? Which texts are you reading which tell you that, you know, Jesus did not provoke quite a bit of conflict and that people fell out all around him? And I think so by the time it gets to level 3, it's edging towards the intractable, and it goes round and round like a washing machine, backwards and forwards. This is how it is in this congregation. You know, a minister will be told, well, if you're going to come here, you better watch, because this is the way that this congregation is. We always argue about X, Y, or Z. And our job in mediation is to try and break some of these patterns and to notice different patterns.
Yeah. Have you, Gwendolyn Soper has a question about whether you've noticed that people who are in leadership are able to influence for the good. I mean, part of this is a complicated question about, often I know that people in leadership might also feel like that they're the failure if a conflict is happening in the congregation. So within the context of this, I know that you'll have lots to say about how someone in leadership can influence, but also whether they should be the only one trying to help.
That's a massive question. I mean, I think the way we train leaders in our churches and you know, the potential to open up the notion of leadership across a much wider group of people and to notice informal leadership in congregations, both for the good and, you know, for the ill, that to notice that there are some factions that are being led and you're not quite sure who's leading them, but also you know that there are influencers in your congregation who are going to really help change a culture. So the notion of leadership is a big one to look at and to understand the dynamics of how human societies operate and human cultures operate. Formal leaderships in churches, for sure, you know, the really powerful leadership we've witnessed in Place for Hope experiences when those in leadership in denominations have made a strategic decision and then have had the wisdom to roll out that decision carefully and slowly with colleagues, building up confidence. That's second to none. That's a fantastic experience when you find that kind of leadership. And it can have a huge, obviously has a huge bearing on the outcome. Very
helpful. Laura Witham has a question about how can you navigate when to avoid a particular conflict and when is it time to address it? You know, I'm sure that can cause conflict.
Well, and for one person, this is the time to avoid. For the other person, this is the time to move into it. So almost inevitably, there's going to be a tension and a difference. And I think, well, if I can draw on some experiences here, I don't know. I mean, I think I mentioned one experience where my co-mediator and I were going fairly slowly, and we'd already established that this conflict had taken literally decades and generations of clergy to emerge, and so we weren't going to rush it. But then a new leadership team was brought in from the top, drew it in the middle of the conflict resolution work, and that really undermined unintentionally. And I should stress that often, you know, most people's intentions are good most of the time, but this leadership approach undermined it. And I think, the speed with which we could work changed dramatically. Remind me of the question.
But it was just about, I suppose, the tension between when knowing to address something and when knowing to avoid it.
So that's right. And so then at that point, what we could have done and maybe should have done was address this particular tension between the different speeds. But we carried on working, assuming that the leadership team would catch up with us and see the wisdom of where we were going. And I think in retrospect, we could have taken a sideways step at that point and paused. But hindsight's a great thing. And I don't know, you go in with the best of antennae and the best of intentions, and you don't always get it right. Listening to your body, often I don't know about you, but people get kind of tinglings in the back of their neck, or see white light, or get kind of, the hairs in the back of your hands stand up. Sometimes being in tune with your body gives you a sense, do you know what, we should maybe just pause here. Something's not quite right. And doing body work can be a really, really helpful way to stay in tune with the
very helpful
nuances of conflict.
I wanted to ask, there's two more questions I wanted to come to. And one of them is one of the major places where serious conflict emerges in a congregation is where there's a theological difference. So because of questions about birth or death, or because of questions to do with the theological imagination of the congregation or the minister, that there's this idea that, the congregation's split. What experiences or what wisdom do you have about how groups who might say, actually, this isn't a conflict between us, this is a conflict about what we believe? What kind of hope or what possibilities is an amicable split a helpful outcome? What are the ways that you have seen that work?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes an amicable split is, the best possible outcome to notice when you've got to separate. I'm going to draw, though, on a pre-mediation experience of mine way back when I was a student studying theology, and I was part of an experiment in theological divergence within one between one congregation and a group of students about sexuality. And we went hammer and tongs at the beginning about, stating our position, one side and then the other side, and it was really quite confrontational. And then we had this revelatory moment, and I think it's what led me into the work of conflict transformation. Let's look sideways at this. So rather than go head to head about what our views were, we actually spent the next session together talking about our views of the Bible. So is the Bible the only source of truth? Is it a guidebook is it a rule book that tells us how to behave? Or is it a set of reflective guidance and to be read through the lens of your current context and everything in between? And we had a very fruitful conversation about how we view the Bible. And then the next week we talked about our views of God and the divine, and without wanting to parody too much, but was God the king, the Lord, the judge, or was God the friend, the companion, the guide, and everything in between? And suddenly our language became much more nuanced, and we saw, even within what had been these two opposing sides, in side A and side B, even in side A, there was nuance and difference about how they viewed the Bible and how they thought about God. And so our conversation became much more nuanced and much more open to the other. And I think looking at an issue from the sideways doesn't mean you're not going to split in the end. And when you come back to that defining issue, you might find that you really have not got common ground.
Yeah. I often think that it's about groupings of people learning how to disagree really well. Yes. Because what we see so often is disagreeing happening really poorly, where all kinds of insult happen. And as you say, still at the end of a congregation that is really split theologically, maybe going separate ways is helpful. But how can that be facilitated in a way where people aren't torn apart, or where there is the minimization of insult in as much as is possible? Not to say that it's easy.
And Pádraig, you have so much experience yourself of this kind of really protracted theological conflict. I'd love to just hear your further response, and how would you handle that? What would your response be to that question?
Well, I think sometimes, so when it comes to a question to do with sexuality, for instance, gay marriage, as it might be called, not that it's just about gay people, there's all kinds of other identities that are important, but that might be the tagline. And often I'm interested in thinking, well, what are the footnotes to that? Because people might say, actually, when I use this term, I mean point A, point B, point C. And actually, sometimes you can realize that people are talking about very different things, even though they're using the same term. And it isn't to say, oh, it's all lovely, let's meet in the middle. I hate the idea of finding common ground and finding a fence. That's utterly unhelpful. But usually what I'm interested in is people realizing, when I say gay marriage or when I say abortion, here's what I'm talking about. And somebody else say, actually, when I say gay marriage or abortion or euthanasia or other birth and life and love issues that we're talking about, when I say that, I'm talking about something else. And suddenly you can begin to disagree in a way that's more accurate. And again, that doesn't mean that people will ever agree or that they'll stay part of the same thing, but that there can be accuracy in terms of how they're disagreeing. But that takes time, and sometimes spending time with somebody in this disagreement is a profound risk. And the threat not only comes from participating, but it comes from your own behind you, who are going in saying, never compromise, never compromise. And underneath that never compromise is, or you'll lose your job too. And those dynamics of power are very complicated to deal with, but it can be helpful to say, let's tone the time down in order to disagree well.
And the layers of fear in that, as you describe, personal fear for your job, for you, even for your physical safety, for your reputation, for the future of your own, your life, for your love, for your congregation.
Yeah. There's so much more to talk about. I wish that we had much more. This is maybe an unfair question to throw to you right at the end, but I know some people were saying, wow, the Samoan circle sounds great, and maybe that works brilliantly in Samoa, and, do Samoans love that other people around the world are using it? What are some British or Irish or Scottish or Highlander models that you might have seen that feel like they've come from the earth of Scotland or Ireland or England, Wales?
Yeah, I mean, we don't... I think fair point about the Samoan circle, and I think we're just acknowledging that this is from a culture that's different from the one that I live in, and it's really important to acknowledge that and to draw the wisdom from that. I think we've been evolving a process called Civic Conversations. It's not an Indigenous Scottish thing by any means, but around the last independence referendum and then around Brexit again, we hosted, so this was when I say we, was Place for Hope, hosted some conversations, when we called them Civic Conversations. And it was really just, what we meant by that was come to these conversations willing to speak honestly from the heart about things that matter and to listen to the other in a way that's going to change you. And we'll establish some really good ways of working at the beginning. So that's the kind of thing we've been doing. And, there's agencies, the whole process towards the Scottish, what now is Scottish devolution, was spearheaded by some religious leaders in Scotland, along with some other great mediators and folks. And so the people of faith in Scotland have been part of difficult conversations for decades, for centuries, but more specifically, the process that led to the result of devolved power in Scotland was a process that was led in part by faith leaders in the Scottish ecumenical scene. So we've got, but we don't have, we steal and we use and we support and we amplify the voice of the folks around the globe who have really good techniques, and we try and acknowledge that wherever we can.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. And thank you for your time and for the many years of work walking alongside in a way where you accompany, almost in a chaplaincy role, people as they're navigating the ground of conflict in places of faith and worship. That can be such a difficult and tender thing to do, because people invest so much in a place of worship that actually when it becomes difficult, the hurt can be corresponding to that. Thank you. People can find out more about the Iona Community by Googling the Iona Community. You can find out more about Place for Hope by Googling Place for Hope. And also, like every denomination will have either internally or outsourced some group that are there to help a congregation in conflict. And I'm so struck by how you say, in general, obviously a broad generalization, but in general, congregations, religious groups leave it a little bit too long before they engage help, and that there's nothing that indicates failure of a congregation or of a minister or of a parish council in saying, let's get some outside help for this. That is a really important thing. That's such profound wisdom that you offer, and that then finding ways to be common about common sense. It's a really helpful thing. Thank you very much, Ruth. Just to let people know, you can sign up for a weekly email from the Spirituality of Conflict project, which is a project that Corrymeela started off by going to spiritualityofconflict.com/sign up. And next week, our guest will be Janet Foggy. And Janet is the Chief Executive Director of Community Energy Scotland, and they provide practical help for communities in green energy development and energy conservation. She's a former parish minister, a member of Place for Hope as well. She holds a PhD in history, is a poet, and also is a small holding farmer. I regularly see photos of ducks and chickens and geese. And so we're looking forward very much to a conversation with Janet Foggy next week, again, continuing on a conversation about the Gospels and conflict. So thank you very much to everybody. We'll send out through Corrymeela's social media the links for anybody who wants to rewatch or share this conversation. We're delighted to be with you, and all the best for continuing your time during Advent. Thanks very much to Johnny Clark for the support in the Zoom room as well. And thanks again to Ruth.
Thank you, Pádraig. Thank you very much.